It's that time of year again. Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today, and for this video we are going to be starting out my end of year wrap up with all of the books I DNF'd in 2022. Before we get into anything bookish, however, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments how many books did you not finish this year. Alright, so like I said, we are starting out my 2022 wrap-up for the year. We're gonna kick things off with all of the books I ended up not finishing. Now, I will say, if I didn't finish this book, not necessarily a bad thing. I might come back to it later. Also, it's possible I just wasn't gelling with it. It might just not have been the book for me. Please don't take this as an insult to your favorite books. I know I'm being silly by giving this disclaimer because honestly, if you're gonna get mad, you're gonna get mad, but whatever. For most of the year, I had an unfortunate record of DNFing about one book a month until about August, where that kicked up a notch. So starting off at the beginning of the year, I did not finish A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. I picked this book up and my friends picked my TBR for a 24-hour readathon vlog. I'll put a link to that in the cards if you're interested. My friend Kat picked this one for me. It is a Hades and Persephone retelling, which is something she adores. I really like the idea of it, but this one kind of read like fan fiction of 50 Shades of Grey. I'll admit, going in, I knew fantasy romance wasn't really my jam. I abhorred the way Persephone was characterized and how she was treated. She constantly was saying she was a strong, independent person. She knew what she wanted. She was going to change the perception everyone had of her, but all of her actions just reinforced what everyone saw in her. This was only worsened once we see how Hades treats her. I've come to realize I don't like power imbalances in relationships. Do whatever you like in the bedroom, but outside of it, both individuals need to be treated as equal partners in the relationship. I was about halfway through this book when I gave up, and even with the interactions we saw between the two of them, I had no faith in this relationship ever going anywhere. Sure, they bantered and flirted, but any actual romance felt a little predatory. One plus I will give this book is I appreciated how St. Clair slid in different connections to other Greek myths. In February, I did not finish Mayhem by Estelle Lohr. This was actually my second or third time trying to read this book. I picked it up for my Second Chances reading vlog, which I'll put a link to in the cards. Honestly, I DNF'd it the first time and I should have just left it there. This was sold to me as The Lost Boys meets The Craft, but honestly, it was just incredibly boring. I couldn't really understand what these supernatural beings were supposed to be. It seemed like the bad guys were vampires, but we never really got any definite answers on whether or not they were supernatural. And then the witches were like almost mermaids instead. At least that's how it seemed, with all of the groundwork being laid. Then there was this really weird romance thing that popped up where the main character is starting to fall for her step cousin. I don't know, that was just really weird. I gave this book 2 different tries and both times it ended in a DNF, so that's it. I'm not trying again. In March, unfortunately, I actually DNF'd a ARC I had received. That was Sorry Not Sorry by Sonia Singh. The title was what automatically made me request this because cute pun, Indian culture, I was all over it. But unfortunately, I actually ended up DNFing about 30% in. We're introduced to our main character who is Indian but doesn't really have any connections to her roots. However, she owns her own company, and when she is photographed for the cover of a magazine, she's actually whitewashed, and that's the final kick she needs to start embracing her culture and exploring it a little bit more. I should also mention her job is to basically break up with people for people via email. My feelings only continue to go downhill when we meet the hero. He is trying to enlist Manny to help him break up with his girlfriend temporarily so he can go to his Indian family's wedding without his white girlfriend. And honestly, that right there sounds like the basis of an am I the asshole that I'm just not interested in. Oh, Manny is also currently engaged to another guy, but his family is very low-key racist and constantly just microaggressive towards her. The writing style was also very dialogue heavy, which isn't a problem for me usually, but the dialogue just felt really inauthentic. Every conversation seemed like it was forced and really long-winded. It was making for a really slow read when usually I blast through romances in no time. This was exacerbated by the fact that I just finished reading A Brush with Love by 𝗖cie his𝘁, which I adored, so that all contributed to me DNFing this. Oh, I guess in April, I also DNF'd a arc, which was Queerly Beloved by Susie Drummond. I mean, come on, look at this cover. It's adorable. I had to request it. This one fell into the trap of being women's fiction, but selling me on a romance, and that's something I have a love-hate relationship with. Occasionally, I have finally found a few books where they're more women's fiction, and I don't mind it, but most of the time I just get upset and am craving more of a romance. This story is set in 2010 Oklahoma and is following our main character Amy, who is in the closet when it comes to her job. Unfortunately, she does get outed and fired, so when she goes to somebody's wedding, she ends up jumping at the chance to be a hired bridesmaid. Along the way, she also meets Charlie, this hot new lesbian in town. I wanted so much more of their relationship, but it really felt like most of this book was purely focused on Amy finding happiness for herself. I have no problem with that kind of story, but in this scenario, it was not what I wanted, and I was so disappointed. I read about 45% into this book, and I probably should have picked up on this women's fiction rather than romance fact earlier when we got so much background about Amy, pretty much nothing about Charlie, her love interest. I just wasn't invested in the two of them becoming a couple. The writing around their romance wasn't really convincing. At one point, the author actually mentions there being sexual tension, and I feel like you shouldn't state that. It should be something the reader can feel in the scene. As I said, there was so much information about Amy that you kind of have to sift through to figure out what's actually important and relevant to the plot and what's just filler content. This made for really slow pacing again. Also, for this being a queer romance book, it's really odd that Amy's gay best friends both felt like stereotypes. One big plus I will always talk about is this book acknowledging period sex. We always need more normalization of healthy female bodies, but unfortunately, I wanted romance. This was women's fiction, so this was not finished. In May, I DNF'd a book which I picked up for a book club that was called The Good for Nothings by Danielle Bonas. This was pitched to me as YA Guardians of the Galaxy as Thieves, and I started it. I was enjoying it, but I was reading it via ebook, and this was right around the time where I was really falling out of love with ebooks, and also it just wasn't appealing to me so much that I couldn't stop reading. I think I just had a lot of other stuff going on at the time. I didn't even bother to write any sort of a review for this one. Thankfully, I didn't DNF anything in June, but I continued my trend with July when I DNF'd Spoiler Alert by Olivia Dade. This was a book club pick, and I actually had a video planned for it. I'll put a link to that video up above. Honestly, looking back on it, I do think I would change some of my commentary, and I am willing to give this another shot because I read this right around the time I had just finished so many other fantastic romance novels that I think I was getting a little burnt out and being overly critical. But with that all being said, this is set in a world where there's this TV show reminiscent to Game of Thrones, and our main character, April, is a giant fan. She ends up posting a cosplay photo, but because she is plus size, she gets a ton of hate. However, Marcus, who plays one of the characters on the show, actually responds and ends up asking her out on a date. Alongside all that, turns out these two are actually best friends online via a fanfiction forum. I love fandom in stories, but I wasn't a big fan of how it was handled here because it seemed like both of them were really ashamed of being a part of the fandom. I understand not bragging about writing fanfiction. I even get not talking about cosplaying, but at one point, April's literally hesitant to say she's a fan of the TV show, and that just seemed really weird to me. I also didn't particularly like the pacing of their relationship. Things end on a not great note at the end of their first date, but when they meet each other for their second date, they quickly end up making out in public, and it just seemed so weird. I love the representation of April being a plus-size heroine, but when it comes to a situation with Marcus talking about something that she interprets as a dig at her weight, it takes them 5 chapters to effectively communicate their feelings and talk that out, and that just seemed like way too long for two individuals who are in their mid to late 30s. As I said, it's possible I was being a little too critical on this when I read it the first time. I am willing to read it again, which is why it's still on my shelves. I don't know when that's gonna happen. Technically speaking, I didn't DNF this book in July. I said I was still reading it, but I haven't touched it since July, so I'm gonna talk about it here. This is the first in a fantasy series set in a world that's reminiscent to casinos. It's been some time and I only read the first 100 pages, so I didn't have the best grasp on the world yet, but I know we were following our female main character whose adoptive mother ended up disappearing whilst investigating this gang, and she ends up traveling to the city to try and find her. She ends up actually working with a smaller gang leader, and things go from there. I was enjoying it, or so I keep saying. I liked the idea of this, but it wasn't really hooking me in at the time. I'm definitely going to give this another chance because I love the idea of this setup. In August, I DNF'd 3. First was A Cosmology of Monsters by Sean Hamill. This was Jan's pick for her full moon book club, and I have been wanting to read this book for quite some time. The base synopsis I knew going in that we were following a family who can all see monsters. However, the son is the only one who lets them into his life. Now, this went through a weird ongoing cycle of I would enjoy the book, something weird would happen, I would start to dislike it, shocking thing, and I would like it again. I was 200 pages into this, and we finally were seeing from that son character and understanding, oh, the monsters that the rest of the family aren't sure are real actually are. This is how he's letting it into his life. They're becoming friends. And then it takes this turn that I literally could not stand. This next line is slightly spoilery, so if you are interested in reading this book still, I'll put a little box around the cover. Once that's gone, no more spoilers. Once the monster was revealed to be a hot chick and Noah, the main character, promptly drops trowel, I was done. So yes, I DNF'd this one, and I believe Jan ended up giving it 1 star also, so apparently I wasn't alone in disliking it. During that month, I also DNF'd Rubbernecker by Melinda Bauer. This was a thriller that was picked for the personal book club I do with some friends. I know it was following our main character who was autistic and trying to solve a crime whilst in medical school, I think. Honestly, I just had no investment in the story. It felt really all over the place. The alternating perspectives just seemed incredibly random. It also felt like the autistic main character was just consistently getting shit on by everybody around him, which was depressing to read. And then one perspective was of someone in a coma, and actual shit kept getting mentioned quite often, a little excessively. Unfortunately, I ended up DNFing this one. Since putting it down, I have heard some people praise it, but the person who picked the book even, I think, only gave it 3 stars. Finally, the last book I DNF'd was a part of a rom-comathon, so I'll put a link to that vlog up above. That was The Flip Side by James Bailey. I picked this up a while ago because I was impressed at seeing a male author in the romance genre, just not something you see for heterosexual romance books quite often, and you know, I wanted to try and support him. That was a mistake, I'm sorry. In the same vein of me hating books being sold to me as romance and turning out to be women's fiction, this was sold to me as romance and turned out to be men's fiction. We're following our main character of Josh, who at the beginning of the book, his life basically implodes. Turns out his girlfriend's cheating on him and he was living with her as well as working for her father, so he no longer has a girlfriend, an apartment, or a job. Probably the first 100 pages of this book, he spends moping and complaining about everything in his life. Once he finally starts making changes to improve himself, he ends up meeting this woman and they have a great 30-minute talk, get along swell. Then she disappears, he never sees her again, and he is determined to find her. Oh, I also should mention the namesake of the book. When all of that terrible stuff happens, he decides to live his life at the flip of a coin. I read 215 pages of it. I was buddy reading this with Michelle. She actually finished it and told me it was not worth it, so I decided to put it down. I could not stand the main character, and I had such a hard time being invested in a relationship where we don't even meet the heroine until halfway through the book, and then they literally spend 30 minutes tops with each other. That's it. That's ridiculous. That is not enough to sell me on a romance between these two. This has been sitting in my unhaul pile for quite some time now. I just haven't taken the time to actually get rid of it. Luckily for me, the last book I DNF'd this year was in September. Unlucky, it was the last book in a trilogy I had been greatly enjoying. That was As Good as Dead by Holly Jackson. This was finished finishing out the Good Girl's Guide to Murder series, but it just took a turn and I did not like where it was going. I wasn't really planning to pick this book up when I read it, but I was on such a high from the second book that I just thought I'd go ahead and jump right in. While I did appreciate the fact that Jackson was giving us real consequences for the events of the previous book, it felt like this just went a little too dark. When we start this book, our main character Pip has been through a lot. She is definitely suffering from anxiety, probably PTSD, and is attempting to numb herself. She's desperate to find a new case that she hopes will put her back to normal. It becomes really apparent in this book how obsessive Pip's personality is. It's definitely a dark portrayal, and it shows great development of Pip's character. It also made for a slower start to the book, but once she finally finds that mystery that she can throw herself into, things start picking up pretty quickly. We actually hit a huge climax at about the halfway point, and shockingly, I actually guessed a twist, which was new for me in this series. While I was so engrossed, I noticed that Pip's actions started to lack logic as things went on. But at the giant twist in the middle of this book, it was like all logic flew out the window. It felt so childish, and although it seemed like the writing around the scenario was trying to showcase it as a logical next move, it wasn't. It was reactive and vindictive. It just didn't feel true to the original Pip that we had known and come to love in the two previous books. And while I appreciate all of the changes she's gone through in this series, I felt like I still always knew who she was as a person, and this twist felt so out of character for her. By that point, my interest completely dropped. I messaged a few friends who also rated it quite poorly. All of them pretty much said it was not worth it to finish. I looked up the ending. I'm very glad I did not finish it. I'm still bitter about it. This was a DNF, and as far as I'm concerned, this is a duology. There's nothing else in this series. All right, y'all, so that is every book I did not finish this year. Thank you so much for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. I have all my socials as well as a few ways you can support me linked in the description. I come out with videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!